Welcome to the Tudor Dynasty. So last week we talked about the Battle of Hastings, which was one of the most important historic events in English history. But today I'm going to follow up with a little bit more about English history and one of the most famous monarchies in all of the history of England. The other reason that I'm choosing the Tudor Dynasty is that it bridges the gap between the High Middle Ages and England entering into the Renaissance, which is where we'll be after winter break. So away we go. And in addition, the Tudor story is just really interesting because it's full of intrigue and violence and, all sorts of craziness. So the Tudor Dynasty is important for a lot of reasons. It lasts from 1485 to 1603, so it lasts for more than 100 years, and it's a time period when England is really going through some important changes. Here are just a couple of them. They are going through something called the War of Roses. The War of Roses. We'll learn more about this in just a little bit, but there's a War of Roses. It lasts for almost 100 years, I believe. And it is the beginning of the Tudor Dynasty. The winner of the War of Roses becomes the very first Tudor. Another thing that's going on during the Tudor Dynasty is the Reformation of the Church. We're starting to see the Catholic Church splinter and split into all sorts of different churches. And one of the kings of the Tudor Dynasty decides that he wants to split away from the Catholic Church for a very personal reason, and it allows for something called the Church of England to be created. And that has a really important role in the history of churches and the way that they work. Finally, the Tudor Dynasty also sees the Renaissance come to England, and people like William Shakespeare and things that you're very, very familiar with that are products of the Renaissance come about as a result, in part, of the Tudors finding it really important to give money to people like William Shakespeare. So away we go, and let's take a look at the 5 kings and queens that are part of the Tudor Dynasty. Okay, so first of all, the Tudor Dynasty, and a dynasty is a reign of a family. So the dynasty is going to last a little over 100 years, and it starts with the very first Tudor is King Henry VII, and here's the story. So there's something called the War of the Roses going on in England, and it's separated into different houses. So there are different houses of people that are powerful. There is a really powerful House of York, which is symbolized by a white rose. And there is another powerful house called the House of Lancaster. It's symbolized...
I have to save the world.
It's symbolized by a red rose. And as this War of Roses between... Sorry, hang on just a second. Sorry about that. Okay, sorry about that. So there's a war between these two houses for who's going to control England, the House of York or the House of Lancaster. And it's something called the Battle of Bosworth. The House of Lancaster defeats the House of York. And the House of Lancaster just happens to be led by a guy named Henry. And here's Henry over here. So the House of Lancaster defeats the House of York in the Battle of Bosworth, and that ends the War of the Roses. Now, in order to try to make peace in England, Henry decides that he is, as from the House of Lancaster, he's going to marry the most eligible bachelorette from the House of York and kind of seal the peace deal. So Henry decides to marry Elizabeth, who is from the House of York, and they form a union. They marry each other, and as symbolic of that, there is something called the Tudor rose, that it's the grafting of the red and white rose from the House of York and Lancaster together. And today you can plant Tudor roses in your garden if you wish, but they're half red and half white. Now these two go on to have 4 children. Henry and Elizabeth they have more children than that, but 4 surviving children. And their children are Arthur, Henry, Margaret, and Mary. So they have 2 boys and 2 girls, and the order I gave you is the order in which they have them. Arthur is going to be like prone, he's going to be provided all the supports to be the next king of the dynasty. So Arthur is going to be the one that they're putting all their time and energy into, and he has a little brother named Henry, who they're not spending as much time with. And then Margaret, their 3rd daughter, will go on to marry a guy named James and become the Queen of Scots. And their last daughter, Mary, will go on to become the Queen of France and marry a guy named Louis XII. Okay? So at this point, they are putting all of their time and energy into their oldest son, and his name is Arthur. So he's in line to be king. And in preparation for that, he is betrothed, which means promised, to an eligible bachelorette from Spain. So they're trying to kind of cement peace in Western Europe by marrying their eligible sons and daughters off to other countries to kind of cement alliances with them. So he is promised to Catherine of Aragon, who just happens to be from Spain. He is promised at 11 years old to marry Catherine. Catherine is a little bit older than him, but not much. I think she's 11 or 12 at the time of the betrothal. But they're not allowed to actually be physically married until they become like 15 years old or something like that. So at 11 years old, he's betrothed to Catherine. At 15, they get married. And during this time period, King Henry VII is still alive. And he's trying to make sure that, this union is strong and all of that. Unfortunately, about 6 months after they are married, Arthur gets really sick and he dies. So now that's a problem because Henry VII is getting older, and the son that they had been preparing for taking over has now died. And so now they have to turn their attention really quickly to Henry, who was their 2nd oldest. So what they want to have done is they want to have Henry marry Catherine of Aragon, because they've already gone to a lot of trouble to try to create this situation and this alliance. So they're trying to figure out how they can do that, because that's a little bit tricky to marry a widow. But right after Henry VII dies, King Henry does indeed marry Catherine of Aragon. So he marries his brother's widow. Down here at the bottom, I just wanted to show you, hang on just a second. I think I'm going to turn that off. It's supposed to be nice, Tudor background music, but I think that it's too distracting. Okay, I wanted to show you down here that there is a royal portrait painter during the Tudor Dynasty that paints the portraits of the kings and queens. And this down here is a portrait by a guy named Hans Holbein, who is a really famous painter during the time period. And I just wanted to show you really quickly, this is King Henry VIII, once he becomes king. And during the time period, it was very fashionable for men to wear skirts that hit above the knee. And it was very, very fashionable for men to wear kind of nylon hose or stockings. And they often wore shoes that had a little bit of a heel underneath the stocking in order to flex the calf. And then you'll notice that in many of the paintings, the calf will be revealed because this calf was considered really attractive. And so the men wore dresses and heels and stockings in order to show off their calf muscles. Okay, so King Henry VIII now becomes the King of England, okay? When Henry VII dies. He will be king from 1509 to 1547. He'd take the throne at right around 17 years old, and he will be King of England until he is 55. He and Catherine together there's a total of 6 children born, but only one is actually going to survive past a year old. And many of the 6 that I just mentioned were stillborn or miscarriages. Okay, so King Henry VIII rules England for quite a long time and is married to Catherine for more than 20 years. Now, here's the problem. Notice the slight heel in the calf again. Now, here's the problem. He's married to Catherine, but she isn't producing a male heir to the throne. And after he has been king for quite a long time, he begins to be concerned about what's going to happen after his death. And so he gets more and more frustrated with Catherine. Plus, Catherine, as queen, has a bunch of ladies in waiting, a lot of young and beautiful women that are waiting on her that King Henry VIII has his eye on. King Henry VIII takes mistresses, and that's not uncommon for kings during the day. But one of the mistresses that he takes, or one of the ladies in waiting that he'd like to have become his mistress, has caught his eye. And he starts to think that, hey, maybe it's been bad luck for me to be married to my brother's widow all of these years if she can't produce a male heir, and maybe I should look to get rid of her and marry someone else. And the someone else is named Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn is one of Catherine of Aragon, his first wife's ladies in waiting. And Henry begins to write love letters to Anne. And Anne says, I like you too, but I'm not going to be one of your mistresses. That didn't go so well for my sister, Mary, who was one of his mistresses. And so she starts writing these love letters back. But she says, if you really want me, you're going to have to get rid of the marriage between you and Catherine. I don't want to just be a mistress. I want to be a queen. And so King Henry VIII goes through a lot of trouble to try to communicate with the Pope about why this marriage between he and Catherine should be annulled. The Catholic Church at the time, well, even today, doesn't believe in divorce. So he was trying to get the marriage annulled, but the Pope told him no. He said, if you wanted to get this marriage annulled, maybe you could have made a case a year or two in, but 20 years in, come on, buddy. You just want to marry a cute young lady. So the Pope said no. And so this is why King Henry VIII is going to begin to experiment with breaking away from the Catholic Church, creating his own Church of England. And when he creates his own Church of England, he gives himself permission to marry someone else. So I'm going to go and show you a little bit about the wives of King Henry VIII, but I'm just going to show you really fast that he had 6 wives. It says Catherine and Anne. This is Jane and Anne and Catherine and Catherine. So he had things for Catherines. There were 3 Catherines, 2 Annes, and a Jane. And now let's go and just see a little bit about each one of them. Okay, so Catherine of Aragon, she was from Spain. She was married to King Henry VIII for more than 20 years. And she had many miscarriages and mishaps with children, delivering children. But she did have one that survived to adulthood, and her name was Mary. She'll come back in the story later on. Now, when Catherine gets kind of kicked to the curb by Henry VIII, she and her daughter, well, she actually stays kind of close to England, but for quite a while, they go back to Spain. Okay, so she's taken her little girl and she headed back to Spain. King Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church, formed his own Church of England, and gave himself permission to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn was a lady in waiting to Catherine. She will be Queen of England from 1533 to 1536, and during that time, she also had 3 miscarriages. She I think that it was a really passionate kind of affair that Anne and King Henry VIII had. But she was also very opinionated and very forceful. And when King Henry VIII was seeking her hand in marriage, I think he found that kind of exciting. But once she was queen, I think he wanted her to submit a little bit more, and she did not. Plus, she also wasn't providing him a male heir to the throne, and he was starting to get older. And so she had one daughter that will survive, and we'll talk about her in just a minute. But he accuses her later on of falling in love and maybe even having an affair with some other people, maybe some stable guys, maybe her own brother. I mean, he goes to great lengths to kind of discredit Anne so he can get rid of her. Just FYI, this is today just outside of Westminster Abbey and the Tower of London, which is where he put Anne when he wanted to try to get rid of her, he imprisoned her in the Tower of London. This is his big hunting grounds. Now today it's a park, but King Henry VIII had such a bad temper that this whole park area was his hunting grounds, and they would actually put animals in the hunting grounds. So when he went off to go hunting for the day, that he would find something, because they didn't want him to come back grouchy, not having been successful at hunting. So this is the Tower of London, where when Anne Boleyn was beginning to not please him so much, he put her there, and eventually had her executed for treason. So he needed to get rid of her to try to move on to somebody who could produce a male heir. And so he had to kind of make up lies. So he sought out people that would make up a story about her and accuse her of incest with her own brother, and maybe even plotting to kill the king or something like that. So they had her beheaded while he was off hunting in that area one day. They did, because she was queen, instead of beheading her the regular way, they did bring in a French swordman, and she was killed with one slice of the sword. But Anne Boleyn lasted for 3 years, and again, instead of the regular executioner, they brought in a fancy French swordsman, and she actually famously provided him with a tip so that he would do it very well. So she brought a little bag of gold coin to her own execution. After she was killed off, King Henry VIII moves on to a really quiet, kind of subdued young lady who also had been one of Anne Boleyn's ladies in waiting. Her name is Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was quiet and respectful and beautiful, and apparently King Henry VIII really did love Jane Seymour. She was queen from May in 1536 to about October 1537, and she finally gives birth to a son named Edward that actually survives beyond infancy. And so King Henry VIII is super happy. However, she died 2 weeks after giving birth to Edward. There's lots of controversy over how she might have died. Some people say it was an embolism, which is like a blood clot in her lung. Some people say she got an infection after giving birth. The birth was 3 days long because he wasn't positioned quite right. And so some people say that it was an infection that set in after that. Either way, after 2 weeks, she is dead. Edward, however, is alive. Henry was really upset by her death, and he wore black for 3 months and actually didn't marry again for 2 years. In order to protect Edward, he puts him pretty much in this this castle, and orders it to be sanitized and cleaned all the time. He's so worried about the welfare of Edward, and that's going to come back later on in our story. Okay, 2 years after Jane's death, Henry decides he is going to marry again, but this time he's not going to worry about love, because he couldn't love anybody more than he loved Jane. And so he decides he's going to just reach out and create a political alliance with another country. And that's how Anne of Cleves comes about. But there's more to the story than that. So he just decides he's going to kind of create a business deal. So 2 years after Jane's death, he sends out his portrait painter to the eligible kings and queens of the region and says, "Can I paint your eligible daughters?" And the painter, Hans Holbein, paints the eligible kind of daughters of the kingdoms close to England, and he goes to Germany and paints Anne of Cleves. So supposedly, according to tradition, Hans Holbein comes back with a variety of portraits for the king to look at, and he sees Anne of Cleves' portrait and decides that that is the woman for him. However, when Anne of Cleves shows up in January of 1540, the king is very, very upset because he doesn't feel like she really looks like the portrait that got painted. And so he makes her the king's beloved sister. He puts her in the friend zone, gives her a beautiful castle, this one right here, and says that you can be my sister and you can live in this castle, but I'm not going to stay married to you. So she is actually going to outlive all the other wives, but they're not going to consummate the marriage, which means they're not going to seal the deal. And she will not actually be the queen for more than 6 months. At this point, the king decides, I'm getting older, I'm just going to have some fun. One of the ladies in waiting to Anne of Cleves was a young girl named Catherine Howard. Catherine was 17, and by this time, the king is 49 years old. She is super immature, though, and the king is growingly overweight, and he has gout. He has this wound on his thigh that keeps opening up, so he's not super attractive at this point. And Catherine decides that she's going to sleep with a guy named like Mr. Culpeper right in the castle. And so this time Catherine gets caught and she's beheaded. She was only queen for about a year, 1540 to 1541. This time the king doesn't even bother to bring in the fancy French swordman because he caught her red-handed. And so she is beheaded, and this leads to the very last wife of King Henry VIII. By the way, all the people that got beheaded are commemorated at a place called Trinity Square Gardens, which is right across from Westminster Abbey in the Tower of London. And it has thousands. All these black squares here are full of inscribed names of people that were killed right outside of the castle with an executioner. Some people say maybe 15,000 people during King Henry VIII's reign. His last wife, King Henry VIII's last wife, her name was Catherine Parr. Supposedly the story is Catherine Parr came with her significant other to be granted permission to marry her significant other. And the king looked at her and said, no, I do not grant you permission to marry him. I grant you permission to marry me. And so without much option, Catherine Parr was married to the king at the end of his life. So she really became like a nursemaid to the king. She was married to him and became queen in 1543. And she was queen until 1547 when he died. And she really was kind of a nursemaid to the king and took care of him during the tail end of his life. About 6 months after King Henry VIII died, she went on to marry a guy named Thomas Seymour, who she had been trying to marry in the first place. Okay, let's go back to the Tudors, though, now, so you know all about the 6 wives of King Henry VIII. Sorry that I'm doing it this way. So he had his 6 wives and was king for a good chunk of time. But after he dies, there are some issues. So Edward, when he dies, Edward, who, remember, was the son who Jane Seymour had, his 3rd wife had, he was the only male that had survived and was legitimate. And so Edward becomes king, but he's only 9 years old. So really, there are other people making the decisions for him at 9 years old. And the unfortunate thing is that because the king wanted to protect Edward, his only legitimate son, so badly, he kept him off in this pretty much like this bubbled off world. He kept him in his own separate castle, totally sanitized. So by the time Edward was kind of introduced to the real world, his immune system was shot. So Edward only lives to be about 17 years old and he dies. And then a real problem occurs because at that point, it's 1553, and there are no more male heirs to the throne. And historically, they had never granted permission to rule to the girls that had been born of a king. But at this point, there's something called the Act of Succession that goes into place, and they legitimize the women that have been born. So now Mary and Elizabeth, who are the daughters of King Henry, are back in play. So Queen Mary becomes Queen of England. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. So Henry VIII's first wife. But if you remember the story, when King Henry VIII kind of kicked Catherine to the curb to marry Anne, Catherine had taken Mary and gone back to Spain. So while England was transitioning away from Catholicism and towards something called the Church of England, Mary was re-immersed in Catholicism back in Spain, where the Catholic Church remained strong. So when she became queen, all this work that had been done to kind of move away from the Catholic Church and create some different type of religious belief in England, it gets undone by Queen Mary, who wants to restore Catholicism to England. So Queen Mary is queen for about 5 years' time. Excuse me, I didn't mean to go. And she is sometimes called Bloody Mary by some because of the number of people she executed in the name of protecting the Catholic Church in England. Now, if you look into the numbers, she executed maybe about 283 people. So it's certainly nothing like the 15,000 that get executed by King Henry VIII. However, her reign is kind of short-lived for a variety of reasons. First of all, like, it wasn't very popular at the time for her to be trying to restore Catholicism to England. In addition, she was trying to figure out a way to get married and to have an heir to the throne as well. So she was spending a lot of time trying to find a partner. She married eventually a guy named Philip from Spain, but she came to believe that she was pregnant when she wasn't. And so there's lots of theories today about what happened, but there was a time period when she started to get nauseous, she started to gain weight. It happened in her belly area, and so people assumed that she was pregnant. She came to believe that she was pregnant. So at this point in history, when you became pregnant, you kind of got removed from public life and like put off into like private life to like take care of yourself for a time. So she got kind of put away, and people kept waiting and waiting and waiting for an heir to be born, and she never produced a baby. What they think today is that psychologically she believed herself pregnant and kind of pushed her body into the symptoms that would have made her seem pregnant, which can happen. Your brain is a powerful tool. Other people think that maybe she had a tumor, that maybe she had stomach cancer, and the tumor kind of presented as if she were pregnant. And so by 1558, she has died, and she did not produce an heir to the throne. Okay, so Queen Mary is replaced by the last of the daughters of King Henry VIII. This is King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's only surviving child, who was a daughter named Elizabeth. And she became Queen of England at 25 years old and would actually go on to rule England for 44 years. She was an extremely important member of the Tudor Dynasty because she moved England from the High Middle Ages into the Renaissance because she decided to spend money that the English treasury had on the arts, on painting, on plays. She financed, for example, William Shakespeare's work. She also was the leader of England when the English defeated the Spanish Armada. So it was kind of like, there were some powerful European countries during that time period. And it's the time during her reign, England became number one. So the Spanish Armada was considered the most powerful navy of the time. And when it was defeated by the English, it was kind of like England moved into the number one spot. She also helped the English national identity to be created. And so when we think of England today, we often think of the England that had been created by Elizabeth I. Now, unfortunately for her, or maybe fortunately, she is called the Virgin Queen, or Gloriana. She's called Gloriana because this time period is considered so important in English history that it's called the Elizabethan era. However, she never did marry and create an heir to the throne. Some people say it was because she fell in love with someone who it was inappropriate, supposedly, for her to be in love with, which was the head of the stables. The proof of that, they say, comes in the suit of armor that was granted, that was purchased by Queen Elizabeth for the guy who ran the stables. And if you look carefully on the suit of armor, which, by the way, would have been very expensive to create, there are a bunch of E's, kind of calligraphy-shaped E's all over the place. And they say this is proof that she was kind of like stamping like her emblem right upon his chest and saying that he's the one for me. However, it wouldn't have been appropriate for the queen to marry kind of the person who who led the stables. And because she wasn't allowed to marry whom she wanted, some people say she chose not to marry anyone at all. And so the Tudor dynasty comes to an end with Queen Elizabeth. And that is it for the Tudor dynasty.